Let's go now to Karina Roman, live in Ottawa. And Karina, what are Canadian officials saying tonight?
Well, we are waiting to see whether we might actually get some kind of statement from the Prime Minister. He is back now in Ottawa after being in the UK for that security conference with European leaders and Ukraine. But we haven't received one yet, but we certainly are keeping an eye to see if one comes out from the Prime Minister. In the meantime, we have heard from Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister reacting really quite soon after Donald Trump made the comments he did today at his news conference. Obviously, there's still a hope that the tariffs can be averted, but Melanie Joly saying if they are not, Canada is ready to fight back. And she talked about what this means to Canada heading into the special Canada-US cabinet meeting. Have a listen.
We know that this is an existential threat to us, and there are thousands of jobs in Canada at stake. Now, we've done the work. We are ready should the US decide to launch their trade war. We will be ready. We are not looking for this. We're not seeking this. I've said it to you many, many times. There's a level of unpredictability and chaos that comes out of the Oval Office, and we will be dealing with it.
Now, what does ready mean? Ready at this point means the same plan as was discussed a month ago, which is $30 billion of immediate retaliatory tariffs, and then within the next few weeks, another $125 billion worth of retaliatory tariffs. And the plan still includes, from what we understand, targeted tariffs in terms of what states and what products could have the maximum impact politically and economically in the U.S. But it's not just about tariff measures. There is still discussion about non-tariff measures, such as, the provinces have talked about this, pulling U.S. Alcohol off their shelves, which, especially in Ontario, which is a huge purchaser of alcohol, foreign alcohol, could be a big move. But also canceling contracts, canceling any kind of openness to working with American companies at municipal levels, at the provincial level of government, and of course at the federal level as well. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, the newly re-elected Premier of Ontario, was out today really talking tough about what the provinces can do, what he'd like to see all the provinces do, and that includes really doubling down on his threat about energy and critical minerals. He was on NBC's Meet the Press. Have a listen.
I'm going after absolutely everything, and I don't want to. We keep the lights on to 1.5 million homes and manufacturing in New York, in Michigan, and in Minnesota. If he wants to destroy our economy and our families, I will shut down the electricity going down to the U.S., and I'm telling you, we will do it. It's unfortunate.
Now, if you'll remember a month ago, even a little bit beyond that, when this was first getting discussed, definitely some hesitation, or even more than hesitation from Alberta to even mention the idea of cutting off energy or putting an export tariff on energy exports and that kind of thing. But hearing tonight a little bit of support, at least, from Quebec on what Doug Ford is talking about in terms of similar ideas of where it would hurt Donald Trump the most, and that is cutting off the very exports that Canada sends to the U.S. that they need so badly.
Well, we heard Doug Ford's comments. Ontario's Premier says he will cut off electricity exports to the U.S. with, quote, a smile on his face. For reaction, let's go to Alberta. Dennis McConaghy is a former energy executive at TransCanada Pipelines, also a commentator on Canada's energy and climate policy, and he joins us from Calgary. You call this a nuclear threat in terms of shutting off energy. How devastating would this move be for both Canada and the United States?
Well, there are, and thank you for having me on, Ian. Let me just say there are regions of the United States, especially New England and New York City, that would be particularly vulnerable under periods of peak demand if Canada were to stop exporting electricity. So that would be a major, major escalation, and undoubtedly, with the person who is running the United States today, give rise to even potentially even more punitive responsive. So I say nuclear because it would be a very major escalation.
And so you have Ontario's Premier talking very tough tonight. What do you think the message is going to be from Alberta to the United States?
Well, it's not to say that if Alberta's crude oil were not going to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, there would not be impacts to all the economic value that the United States derives from that trade. Admittedly, if in fact it comes out that there's only a 10% tariff on energy exports as it applies to Canada, or as it would apply to Alberta, that is a perhaps more manageable incremental cost. So I think it's obvious that Alberta would be really the last party to consider the disruption of supply of energy export into the United States However, we don't have an auto industry in Alberta, so it's understandable just how, just what the Premier of Ontario is considering at this time.
Yeah, so let's dig into that for a moment from an Alberta perspective. You are in Calgary. You have expertise as someone who is in the energy business. If this 10% tariff on energy exports from the United States to Canada were to come into effect at midnight, as we're told to expect, what's that going to mean for Alberta?
Well, it's going to be a tug of war between Alberta and, the corporate interests that own the oil supply and U.S. refiners. Who has got the most leverage? Who has the most optionality to bear those incremental costs? One way or another, a 10% increase in the cost of that trade has to be borne by some party because the money has to be paid to the U.S. Treasury. And, of course, many of us have been concerned that Alberta really has only one export market for this oil, that is to the United States. And so there's been great concern that the majority of that hit will fall to Alberta interests, whether it's the Alberta government through royalties or the actual corporate interests that move that oil to the U.S.
So this could be a transfer of wealth from the Alberta people, their government, in terms of royalties to the United States.
Well, it's kind of an incremental cost that is being imposed on this to, in normal terms, a very productive trade between Alberta and the U.S. Gulf Coast. When that with extra cost has to be absorbed, it may be that Alberta will have to take that hit. And as far as the U.S. is concerned, they may also bear some other disruptions if they ever had to try to find incremental supplies of heavy oil on the open market. So, I mean, that is the great concern, that the majority of this hit will fall to Alberta. I'm just saying that it's not the same kind of catastrophe as potentially a 25% tariff on the auto trade, which would lead to even more extreme countermeasures being considered, as I think dangerous as they might be to actually implement.
We have just 30 seconds, but I mean, it's a big question, I know, but let me ask it. Knowing what you know about pipelines and the energy industry, what about this being the thing that motivates Canada to move that oil via pipeline elsewhere rather than to the United States?
But one of the great tragedies of the last 10 years is that the pipelines that could have been in place today, particularly Northern Gateway, were not put in place. So I'll just close by saying it will be very hard to put in place that kind of infrastructure in any meaningful timeline to be helpful in this dispute.
All right, Dennis, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening.
Thank you.
Dennis McConaghy, former energy executive at TransCanada Pipelines, and he is in Calgary.